Welcome to episode 109. I'm Stuart McCullough, I'm the CEO of VHIA. And starting with this week's Industrial Roundup. For this week's Industrial Roundup, we'll start with community health. And in particular this week, we're meeting with members along with our colleagues from VHIA to discuss the regulations for the Long Service Benefits Portability Act. We have two key concerns with respect to the regulations and the application of the Act more generally. The first of those goes to the clarity in terms of the scope. We'll be seeking further clarification in that respect. But the second goes to the anti-double dipping provisions. These are provisions that are intended to ensure that someone does not claim both under the scheme and claim a federal instrument long service leave entitlement. Our concern remains that those regulations and that those provisions cannot have the purported effect that they seek to have. So that's a concern that we'll be raising as part of that process. With respect to our health service members, much of our attention at the moment is focused on preparing the Nurses and Midwives draft log of claims, which is due to be submitted to the department by the 30th of June. The key underpinning theme with regards to the draft that we're working on is the issue of complexity equaling cost. That is, we have a complex environment with regards to industrial instruments where they look as though they apply to different businesses rather than to a single employer. In terms of cost in that circumstance, we're talking about cost without benefit. So that's the underpinning theme. We're also continuing to meet with members and the AMA to discuss the draft schedules applying to preserved conditions for medical specialists. Just a reminder to members that you should have received by now an invitation to join VHIA's VHIA network. This will be replacing the VHIA Community app, which is decommissioned in June, and it will be the means by which we provide the meeting-by-meeting updates to members during the course of bargaining. In terms of items that are coming up, in June, you can expect the finalised VHIA bargaining framework, which will be distributed, including to CEOs along with an executive summary. And in July, we'll be publishing timeframes for some of the administrative steps associated with bargaining, including the authority to act. The authority to act this time will be done individually for each agreement. Those are all the matters arising from the Industrial Roundup for this week. As always, all of our activities are summarised through VHIA's VHIA network. It's now time for the weekly update. Welcome to the weekly update, where we go in depth with a particular subject. And joining me for this week's discussion is Senior Workplace Relations Consultant Emma Scott. Welcome, Emma.
Thanks, Stuart.
Emma, would you be good enough to reveal the clue for the today's subject for discussion?
I can.
So for the benefit of those people who are listening to this podcast rather than watching, could you describe the object that you have there?
Oh, it's upside down, this side. But it is a country practice All My Friends record.
And if you flip it over.
Or flip it over this way. Sons and Daughters, All My Friends.
So this is a record by the cast of two long-running soap operas, and it features a number of people really committing a crime against music generally. Just looking at some of these hits, we've got Dream a Little Dream of Me by Shane Withington. He was on a country practice. The less said about the content of this record, the better. But on the basis of this particular clue, what would you say is the subject for today's discussion?
I'm actually 100% sure that it is really about your questionable music taste.
I don't really think that's fit for a podcast as such, and I think that's a little off topic. Would you like a second guess?
Well, you said they're like into crimes?
Into crimes? Yes, I think what we're really saying that with regards to this particular record, that this is a criminal record, which does bring us to today's subject with regards to police checks and criminal records.
Now I get it.
So Emma, let's start off with police checks, and in particular, what is a national police check?
So a national police check is where agencies, based on particular data such as like your first name, surname, birth date, take that information and match it against the criminal history of a lot of other applicants or people, and then they match it up through an algorithm, and then what they do is then also someone looks at it to see if there is particular offences that match the information that's put forward in a police check.
And so what happens after a national police check is done?
So once one is done, there is a certificate that is issued, so it's either got no offences on it or it also has disclosable offences related to any charges that is really about their criminal history for the person that has made the application. So there will be offences such as, like, if it was to occur, particular things like assault and those type of offences, I guess, yeah.
Okay, so that comes back as a certificate?
Yes, yeah, correct.
So I know for me, I've got my certificate framed at home, but in terms of what other people might do with them, and in particular, what is the connection between that document and employment?
So really for employment, employers use the police checks to make informed decisions about employing individuals, so through your recruitment process, or also continuing to employ individuals that are already existing as well.
So we'll dig a little bit deeper into that in a moment, but let's start with whether or not it's mandatory. Is it mandatory for an employer to obtain a national police check?
So generally speaking, no. However, there is a requirement under the Aged Care Act through the accountability principles where an employer is obligated to ask for a police check from employees. And then there are some offences that preclude employees from gaining employment or continuing to work in employment in aged care. Additionally, although it's quite a little bit different, is the working with children's check under the working with children's legislation in Victoria for when people are working with children.
So there are a couple of examples where there's a legislative framework in aged care, working with children, but those may not be the only sources. What about funding agreements?
Yeah, so some we have seen, and there have been some decisions on it where through funding agreements they do outline that there are particular requirements around police checks and asking for that information.
Okay, so in terms of the delivery of a service.
Yes.
But that said, it's not an issue that's necessarily unique to health.
No, it's not. It is actually common in other industries to also do police checks.
So Emma, you mentioned before the accountability principles relevant to aged care, which has a range of identified precluded offences. These are things that preclude people from working in that sector.
Yes.
What are those precluded offences?
So they're convictions of murder and sexual assault, but it also applies where someone is convicted of or imprisoned for other assault.
So for those other areas outside of the precluded offences where there aren't mandatory requirements, how should offences that aren't in that precluded category be treated?
Unfortunately, it's not that clear, and it will depend on a number of circumstances.
So it's difficult to tell where the line is drawn in some instances?
Yeah, it definitely is. I think one of the main factors is relevance. That's definitely a consideration that actually has to occur.
And what is the relevance of relevance?
So the relevance of relevance is it's relevant, but it's really just making sure that there's an established link between the offence that is, say, disclosed on a police check and the inherent requirements of the position that the employee is actually in or, say, being offered.
Okay, so we've got for the Aged Care Act, through the accountability principles, we have some offences that preclude you from working in aged care, but then we've got other offences where if the issue then becomes whether or not they affect the inherent requirements of the role.
Yes.
So what is the relevance of the inherent requirements of the role? What are we talking about there?
So what we're talking about is making sure that the offence that's disclosed, that there's a clear link with employment and that's related to the essential part of the role. So that's really about ensuring that it's not about those tasks that are incidental, peripheral or accidental to the role.
Okay, so just to be clear, when we're talking about connection to employment, we're not saying that the offence occurred in employment, but that the nature of the offence somehow relates directly to and has a correlation to the work that the person performs?
Yes, it can't be just a general correlation, it has to be quite a tight
direct
correlation, yes.
Okay. So we've dealt with the inherent requirements. Let's talk about the next consideration. What does proportionality mean in this context?
So that's really about whether terminating or excluding the individual from employment is proportional to the particular offence that's occurred.
Okay, so it can't be a disproportionate outcome?
Yes, that's correct.
What about timing? Is that relevant? Is that a relevant consideration?
Yeah, I'd say timing is definitely relevant, and we'd really put that in the space of also connecting to employment history. So it may be that an offence has occurred a previous history and they've been employed since that. You'd look at those particular things. Your references that you get along with the timing, it may be that things have changed since that point in time and they've been employed in the particular role that was still related to the offence in their previous employment, that there were no issues. That may be a relevant consideration.
I often think in terms of time, sometimes you have things that somebody's done in their youth.
Yes.
And a lot of time has passed.
Yes.
And that the connection gets weaker.
Yes.
Over a period of time.
Yep.
So just in terms of things like a pattern of offences, can that also be relevant?
So with pattern of offences, what it might be is that you get a police check that comes through and that the offence is a one-off, or it may be that they occur more than once, and it could be once a month, which obviously then would link to it being quite a regular pattern where it may be that they haven't really changed their particular habit.
So we're looking there to see whether or not the likelihood of that issue arising again. Mm-hmm. Are there any other considerations?
So yes, I think really that's about what information is given to you from the employee. And this is still all related to timing as well, is that it may be that the offences occurred previously and that they have gone through relevant interventions or programs to help them with, I guess, what you might say is rehabilitation, possibly.
So that's really interesting. What we've talked about are precluded offences, then there are offences that don't disqualify you effectively, and that if those are to be taken into account, that there are a range of considerations including proportionality, timing, relevance, whether there is a pattern. It seems to me that in the event that a national police check does pick something up, that it's not simply proceed directly to go, and that it is necessary to give some consideration, then that consideration might be quite complex depending on the circumstances.
Yes, that's correct. It would be nice if there was a hard and fast rule to say 1 + 1 equals see you later, but unfortunately there isn't such a kind of mechanism.
I'm not sure it's a bad thing. I mean, I think it's actually quite appropriate that it should be hard and complex, and that people need to actively turn their mind to the relevance or connection to work and all that sort of stuff.
Yes.
So what's our recommendation to employers in terms of a policy framework in terms of criminal records and the disclosure process?
It's really making sure that there are policies and procedures in place to kind of outline what that expectation is. It's about people knowing exactly what might occur if there is something, and making sure that ongoing there may be a requirement to ensure that they're still disclosing things when they're in employment. It's not just about before employment, but also during employment. So
my sense would be that most VHIA members will have a policy framework for dealing with the disclosure at the outset and then ongoing disclosure. But what are the kind of things that impact upon that policy setting in terms of legislation, for example?
So say, for example, there's also the Equal Opportunity Act that has a particular preclusion from discrimination based on criminal record, but still, again, it is about the inherent requirements of the job. If the non-employment or the termination is related to the inherent requirements of the job, then it isn't seen as discrimination.
And there's federal legislation as well, from memory, on that to the same effect.
Yes.
That you can't discriminate on the basis of a criminal record. There is that exception for inherent requirements of the role.
Yeah.
So I think where things get tricky is where somebody has been employed prior to this requirement being introduced, and what the effect on an employee in that circumstance is, and how how employers really go about navigating that circumstance. That is, an employee who might be a long-standing employee is now required to provide a police check, and it throws something up.
So really it's still, if they are employed and you have got a process for disclosure, and say for example if they haven't disclosed something to you that has come up during employment and it's clear that that is your particular entitlement, you've asked for it, what it may be is that it may fall in the disciplinary space.
So you're characterising that as a circumstance where there was a requirement to disclose and a person has breached that policy requirement.
Yes, correct.
And that could take you to the disciplinary procedure.
Yes.
So there is more information with regards to disciplinary procedures available to members?
Yes, we've done a podcast kind of towards the beginning of when we did the podcast, so it's number 16.
Way back at 16.
Yeah, and that's really, it mostly covers the public sector enterprise agreements, but it can also be useful for other members to have a look at, listen, because we do outline some general principles that do apply as well.
So that's one circumstance where somebody hasn't complied with a policy setting to disclose. What's an alternative circumstance?
So in circumstances where it's not covered, say, by the disciplinary process, our agreements actually don't stipulate a process for employers to follow, but it still doesn't, obviously there is still the unfair dismissal legislation that employers should make sure that they don't fall afoul of. So really, again, it's addressing those considerations that we've talked about earlier, the main one being there has to be a valid reason, which is the inherent requirements of the job. And if there is there, there is a valid reason, but there are those other hurdles as well, which is the harsh, the unjust and unreasonable, which is really going to factor in those other considerations that we've spoken about.
So that's a really important thing to emphasise, that where a national police check does pick up a criminal record, that you do actually, again, have to think things through in terms of what that means. It's not an automatic, doesn't have an automatic result. So you mentioned before a little bit about process. What kind of process would we recommend to members who are managing that kind of circumstance?
So employers should make sure that there is a process so the employee is provided with an opportunity to discuss the offences that are disclosed on the police check. And that's really about providing that opportunity to talk and discuss about those relevant considerations that we have outlined and discussed earlier, because if those considerations aren't looked at, then there's a higher claim for someone to actually have a successful unfair dismissal case, which also includes telling them that they're entitled to support or a representative, and not rejecting that if they do actually ask for that.
So it's a procedural component, but it's also a way of making that decision-making process as informed as it possibly can be, because it's a really strange situation. Overwhelmingly, you're acting on things that happen during employment.
Yes.
And performance or conduct in a role. It's a really difficult and unusual thing to have to consider action for something that occurs outside the role but impacts upon it.
Yes.
Would there ever be a place for something as dramatic as a stand-out?
There would, and again, it does depend on the particular circumstance, the role, and obviously the offence. So if it is that there is, I guess, a higher risk related to the conduct and the link, so it may be that you have an offence that looks like there's a partial link, but it's not that clear with what that link is. It may be that an employer chooses not to stand down, but if there is a higher risk where it is, possibly assault that happened that was just, convicted a month ago, then it may be that it's a higher risk that there is a stand down, especially when it comes to OH&S risks.
I like that consideration of dealing with it from a risk perspective. I guess from my perspective, risk standing down is one way to manage a risk.
Yes.
There may be other less dramatic ways to manage a risk, such as potential redeployment, depending on the circumstances. Would you agree with that?
Yes, there definitely is that to consider, which may be, redeployment into another role while you're considering those particular aspects of that, but that also is a consideration in general for, say, continued employment as well, not just for, say, instead of a stand down, it is also still a relevant consideration ongoing. It doesn't have to be a big one, but it's good for people to actually think about.
So this is a really vexed issue.
Yes.
What if you've given all the consideration that you can,
Yes.
and it's not clear as to whether or not employment should be ended.
So again, an employer can make a decision based on the level of risk, and it may be that if it is a low risk, that they would continue employment. Whereas if it was, say, a higher risk, then it may be that keeping them in employment is too high, and that it would be better to take that risk, terminate, and then have to deal with an unfair dismissal claim later on down the track.
So again, dealing with risk,
Yes.
considering the impact on other employees,
Yes.
patients, public,
Yes.
and those sort of things. I guess probably the other thing for me is that when we're talking about risks, you can also talk about measures to control
Yes.
a risk other than termination of employment. So that might be a relevant factor for people to consider.
Yeah.
I guess probably we also need to cover off another circumstance is, because we've talked about where it's not been disclosed, but what if a circumstance arises where the employer is aware and has been aware, a disclosure has been made but doesn't do anything until much later on?
So it won't work in an employer's favour. There have been some decisions in the commission that was related to, well, they've already continued particular employment with that conviction and nothing has happened. So part of those things do not work in the employer's favour. So we definitely recommend to get straight on top of that.
So just in terms of that, I guess, would there be an exception where the framework changes, such as the introduction of the accountability principles, would have meant at a certain point in time people needed to consider whether there were precluded offences that any of their employees had at a point in time. So I guess the rules could change from time to time, but generally speaking, if you're aware, you should be acting, and trying to act belatedly may count against you.
Yes, correct.
Well, Emma, thank you for that overview with regards to criminal record checks and criminal records generally. I think there's no better way for us to preclude this podcast than by not playing a track from this record.
I think that's a good idea.
Emma, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Stuart.
VHIA.com.